Welcome to the deep dive. Now, as a philosopher, you've probably spent a lot of time thinking about something really fundamental, but also kind of surprisingly elusive. Your own bodily awareness.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always there, right? It's the very ground of our experience. But it often, fades into the background. We don't always directly pay attention to it.
It really is this fascinating paradox, isn't it? Our bodies are always providing this stream of information, both external and internal.
Right.
Like we can see them, touch them, we feel them.
Yeah.
Yet, there's this study in 2007 that used a beeping device, and it actually found that people could be completely unaware of even just basic sensations, like the feeling of their feet on the ground.
Wow.
And it just highlights how this ever-present body that we have, it can so easily fade into the background of our awareness.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, this is something that thinkers like Later and Merleau-Ponty and O'Shaughnessy, they've all really grappled with this inherent elusiveness.
Exactly. And this brings us to, I think, a really core question for you as a philosopher. What exactly is this awareness of our own body? I mean, William James Beck in 1890, he offered a beautiful, I think, description. He talked about this constant, if often, sort of marginal sense of our body's position and condition.
Right.
He called it a feeling of the same old body always there.
That's a great way of putting it.
But I guess as a fellow philosophical explorer, can we move beyond such evocative language to maybe a more rigorous, precise understanding?
That's exactly what we're aiming to explore in this deep dive. And of course, this isn't a novel philosophical pursuit. I mean, think about Aristotle. Recent work by Campigiani has really reminded us how he recognized this deep connection between bodily sensations and emotions. And of course, there's Descartes, who famously used the pilot in the ship analogy. But as Chamberlain has pointed out, this has been widely rejected precisely because it seems to downplay this intimate bond that we have with our bodies.
Yeah.
And then you have Spinoza, Nadler, he knows how Spinoza even linked consciousness to the body's complexity.
Right. And then, of course, we have the whole phenomenological tradition, right? Husserl, Gurvitch, Merleau-Ponty, Henri, and then more contemporary thinkers like Gallagher, Mishara, Carmen, Whirl, and Doyon.
Right.
For whom lived bodily experience was absolutely central. I mean, they really, really delved into the nature of embodiment, right?
Indeed. And what's, I think, particularly noteworthy is this sort of recent surge of interest within the analytic tradition.
Yeah.
And it's running alongside these exciting developments in cognitive neuroscience.
Right.
You look at all the numerous edited volumes that have come out. I mean, from Bermudez et al.
Right.
Back in 95 all the way to Al Smith and Longo just last year.
Yeah.
It really underscores this ongoing and really multifaceted nature of this inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. And this leads us to, I think, the really, really intriguing phenomenon of bodily distortions, right? So these can be pathological, like phantom limbs, where individuals actually feel sensations in limbs that they no longer have.
Yeah.
Or they can be non-pathological, such as the rubber hand illusion demonstrated by Botvinnik and Cohen in 1998. And it's quite striking, right? You have a rubber hand and it's stroked in sync with your own hidden hand, and it can feel as though that artificial hand is part of you.
It really is incredible. And for you as a philosopher, I think these illusions, they raise some really profound questions.
Yeah.
What does it truly mean for something to feel like part of your body?
Right.
Where do those boundaries of our bodily self-awareness actually lie?
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that a simple manipulation like that can so dramatically alter our sense of embodiment, I think it's deeply revealing about maybe the constructed nature of our bodily self.
It really does. It really does. It challenges that intuitive sense of our body as this fixed and undeniable entity, maybe suggesting a more malleable system, perhaps one that's built from integrating all these various sensory inputs,
Exactly.
So what exactly is our goal today in this deep dive? What are we setting out to understand?
Well, I think our aim is to really dissect this unique way that we experience our bodies, but from the inside.
Okay.
We want to compare this, what we might call the inside view, to how we perceive the external world.
Okay.
We want to assess the reliability of this internal knowledge that we have about our body.
Right.
And even consider whether it even qualifies as a form of perception.
Right.
We're also going to explore the crucial role of mental representations, which are often called the body schema.
Right.
And finally, we're going to review different philosophical accounts of that fundamental sense of body ownership, the feeling that this particular body is yours.
Okay, great. So let's start with this idea of the body from the inside. I mean, it seems intuitively obvious that our access to our own body is different from how we experience, external objects like a table.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, on the one hand, our body is a physical object in the world, just like any other.
Right, right.
But our relationship to it, our perception and experience of it, that's distinct.
Okay.
O'Shaughnessy described it as a highly unusual relation, this unique epistemological link between a person and, well, what's undeniably their own body.
So what are the defining characteristics of this inside mode of knowing our body? What makes it so unique?
Well, initially, it seems to be about the information we receive through our internal senses.
Okay.
Things like touch, proprioception, which is our sense of body position, balance, pain, interoception, which is our awareness of our internal bodily state.
Right.
All of these.
Yeah.
But, it's not clear if these actually form a unified category. What many of them do seem to share, though, is a connection to this idea called immunity to error through misidentification relative to the first person, or IEM.
Okay, IEM. Let's unpack that a bit.
Okay.
So it's this idea that, if I feel a pain, for instance, I might be wrong about the specific cause or location,
Right.
but I can't really be mistaken about who is feeling that pain.
Yeah.
It's inherently my pain, right?
Exactly. Thinkers like Shoemaker and Evans, they really laid the groundwork here.
Yeah.
If I judge I am anxious because I feel anxious, that self-description, it seems immune to this error of misidentifying the subject.
Right.
But, if someone else tells me I seem anxious, they could be mistaken.
Totally.
So the idea is that our body senses, they provide this privileged access
Yeah.
to information about our own body.
Okay.
And it makes judgments like my legs are crossed
Mm-hmm.
based on proprioception, fundamentally different from seeing legs and identifying them as mine.
Okay. So this bodily IEM, this has been used as an argument, I think, for an embodied self, suggesting that the I experiencing these sensations is fundamentally tied to this particular body, right?
That's right. And that's a key point that's been made by philosophers like Evans and Kassam.
Yeah.
Because we can attribute these bodily properties to ourselves without needing this separate step of identifying who's having that experience.
Right.
It suggests that the self isn't some detached Cartesian mind, but rather a bodily subject of both mental and physical experiences.
Okay.
However, as Chen and Smith J have pointed out, some philosophers, they do question whether we can actually draw such a strong metaphysical conclusion from this purely epistemological observation.
All right.
And others, like Shoemaker and Kaliva, they even debate whether bodily IEM is actually the same kind of absolute IEM that we might find with certain mental states, like the feeling of specific emotion.
So what about those apparent challenges to bodily IEM, like the rubber hand illusion, for instance, where individuals seem to attribute ownership to a hand that isn't actually theirs, right?
Yeah, that's a really crucial point, and that's been raised by philosophers like Mizumoto and Ishikawa.
Yeah.
But the counter argument, as suggested by Salge and Vignemont, is that the epistemic basis for self-ascription in these illusory cases is actually different from our typical somatosensory judgments.
Okay.
So these illusions, they might suggest that bodily IEM is more of a common occurrence rather than a logical necessity.
Okay.
But they don't necessarily undermine the idea that our body senses typically provide this privileged self-specific access.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got this inside view that's characterized by, these internal senses and this idea of IEM.
Right.
Now let's consider the body from the outside. So primarily through vision, I guess.
Okay. I think the general consensus is that vision, unlike our body senses, it doesn't inherently guarantee bodily IEM.
Okay.
And Mach's famous anecdote of mistaking his own reflection for someone else, that really illustrates this point. We can visually perceive a body and its properties.
Yeah.
But there's always this potential gap between knowing that a body is F and knowing that my body is F.
But some, like Gibson and even Evans himself, they've suggested that maybe this isn't so clear-cut, right?
Oh, yeah.
That even visual experiences carry information about our own body and our sort of egocentric perspective.
Exactly. Gibson argued that all perceptual systems are, to some extent, propriosensitive.
Okay.
So they're providing information about the observer's own actions and position.
Right.
And he pointed out that when I see a tree in front of me, I can't really doubt, someone is standing in front of a tree, but is it I?
Yeah.
This suggests that our egocentric visual experiences might actually secure IEM for judgments about our own location.
Okay.
And some argue that even visual experiences of our body, like seeing my hand from a particular angle, that this could also guarantee IEM in certain contexts, just due to basic biological facts about perspective.
Interesting. And the role of multimodality seems really crucial here as well, right? Our bodily self-knowledge isn't just coming from these separate inside and outside channels, is it?
No, not at all. And as research by Stein and Meredith and Ernst and others has shown, our senses are constantly interacting.
Yeah.
They're influencing each other at very early stages of processing.
Okay.
Even the rubber hand illusion itself is a prime example of this.
Yeah.
This integration of somatosensory and visual information leading to a false sense of ownership and proprioceptive drift and even referred sensations.
Yeah.
So vision often plays this dominant role, especially for spatial information.
Yeah.
And it can even affect how we phenomenally experience our bodies.
So this challenges the idea of a purely inside access, suggesting that even our internal sense of our body is being shaped by what we see.
Precisely. Even Schilder, even before much of this multisensory research, he described the body schema as a kind of synesthesia between visual and tactile information.
Mm-hmm.
And this raises some fascinating philosophical question that's explored by Bennett and Hill and O'Callaghan.
Okay.
Does this multimodality, does it mean that vision only causally influences our bodily experience? Or is it a constitutive aspect of that experience?
Wow.
And if our self-attributions of bodily states, if they rely not only on IEM guaranteeing body senses, but also on vision,
Okay.
does that undermine the whole idea of bodily IEM?
Yeah.
So it's a very complex and ongoing philosophical discussion.
Okay. All right. So we've looked at the body from the inside, from the outside, how they interact. And now I think let's delve into this question. Is bodily awareness a form of perception? I mean, it might seem, obvious for something like touch, but what about pain or hunger, for instance?
Right, and that's exactly what philosophers like Aid have been questioning. They've questioned whether all bodily experiences actually qualify as perception,
Okay.
particularly those that seem more subjective
Yeah.
and less clearly directed at an external object.
Oh, okay.
Even focusing on transitive bodily sensations like touch, they differ from vision in several ways.
Okay.
I mean, they're constantly active. They
Yes.
often function outside of our conscious awareness.
Yeah.
And they don't always seem to provide this clear sensory field analogous to our visual field.
Right.
Furthermore, there appear to be some epistemic asymmetries.
Okay.
Bodily sensations are often perceived as less reliable than visual information about the external world.
Okay. So maybe some of these objections arise from taking vision as the prototypical model of perception, right?
Right.
I mean, if we consider other senses like smell,
Yeah.
maybe bodily sensations fit the perceptual mold a little better.
Okay.
And what about the multisensory integration that we were just discussing, right?
Right.
If I feel that my legs are crossed based on, integrated visual and proprioceptive information, does that constitute a perceptual judgment about my body?
That's the crux of the issue.
Yeah.
You have McGinn, for example.
Yeah.
He argued that bodily sensations don't have an intentional object in the same way that perceptual experiences of the external world do.
Okay.
He raised two key points.
Okay.
First, he said that the body can't simultaneously be the subject of perception and an object of perception without leading to this infinite regress.
Right.
And it's a point also touched upon by Merleau-Ponty with his distinction between the objective body and the lived body. And Gallagher similarly argues that the lived body must be the subject, not an object, in order to actually ground our experience.
Right. Yeah.
The second point McGinn raised was Shoemaker's standard model of perception.
Yeah.
It emphasizes this ability to identify and re-identify the perceived object.
Okay.
The challenge with body senses is that they seem to provide access to only one object, our own body.
But there have been counter arguments to this, right? I mean, Schwenkler, for instance, he suggests that our body senses, they actually convey information about different parts of the body, which could be considered distinct objects.
Yeah.
And Martin, he defends this sole object view.
Yeah.
He argues that even if bodily sensations are only about our own body, they can still be perceptual.
Oh.
I mean, we experience our body as a bounded object, right?
Yeah.
And this awareness of bodily boundaries, he says, can even contribute to our awareness of a larger spatial environment.
Exactly. And then there's this unique spatiality of bodily awareness.
Right. Yeah.
O'Shaughnessy describes sensations as having both an A location, which is a body relative frame,
Mm-hmm.
and a B location, which is an external frame.
Okay.
However, as Merleau-Ponty observed, he said that ordinary spatial relations do not cross the experience of bodily space.
Okay.
It doesn't seem to follow, the standard spatial rules.
Right. Yeah.
So pain in my thumb, it isn't felt in my mouth if I bring my thumb there.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make sense to say that the pain in my thumb is far from the pain in my foot in the same way that my hand is far from my foot.
Right. Right. It's very different. Yeah.
And this has led some, like Nordhoff, to propose that feeling pain in a finger might indicate the state of the finger rather than a spatial location of the sensation itself.
And this brings up the local sign theory, which denied that sensations have any inherent spatiality. But that seems problematic for explaining, how I can distinguish between a touch on my right versus my left hand, for instance, or the experience of sensations in phantom limbs, right?
Right.
The spatial aspect seems undeniable.
It does. And Smith, A.D., he argues that perception requires the possibility of achieving, different perspectives through self-movement and the existence of perceptual constancies.
Okay.
But since we can't feel our body from different perspectives in the same way that we can see a table from different angles, he concludes that bodily sensations aren't truly perceptual.
Okay.
Mathen, he draws a distinction within touch between, basic tactual sensation and more sophisticated haptic perception.
Okay.
And he argues that only the latter, that more sophisticated haptic perception, is truly spatial and perceptual.
Okay.
On the other hand, Martin, MGF, he suggests that we can simply, we can shift our attention between the bodily and external aspects of the same tactile experience.
Okay.
However, he does agree with others that touch lacks this unified tactile field that's comparable to the visual field.
Right.
Yeah.
Now Wittgenstein and Anscombe, they offered a different kind of challenge to the perceptual model.
Yeah.
And they focused on this idea of knowledge without observation.
Right. They argued that our ability to report the position and movement of our limbs doesn't actually depend on sensations of position. Yeah. In the same way that that knowing the sky is blue depends on seeing it.
Okay.
Anscombe, she famously claimed that bodily knowledge, it can't be based on sensations unless those sensations have independently describable content.
Okay.
So for her, knowing my legs are crossed is more akin to knowing how to uncross them,
right,
than to feeling them being crossed.
Yeah.
It's a form of practical knowledge.
Okay, so the interpretation of this knowledge without observation have been debated, of course, right?
Yeah.
And Anscombe's reliance on phenomenological intuition has been questioned, especially in light of bodily illusions.
Right.
So if I can feel my arm moving due to, tendon vibration, even though it's still,
right, yeah,
doesn't that suggest that there's a sensory basis for my judgment of its position?
Yeah, I think the difficulty seems to lie in precisely defining what constitutes an independent description.
Right. Okay. So interestingly, both the phenomenological and the analytic traditions that reject this purely perceptual model,
right,
they often emphasize the role of action in our awareness of our bodies.
Some do.
So Merleau-Ponty, for instance, he saw the lived body as fundamentally a space of possible actions.
Right.
And for Anscombe, as we discussed, knowing our body is often tied to knowing how to act with it.
Okay.
So this emphasis on action has led to various sensory-motor theories of perception.
It has.
So such as the inactive approach and the dispositional approach, could you briefly outline the core ideas of each for us?
Certainly. So the inactive view, which is championed by O'Regan and Noe and others,
right,
it proposes that our perceptual experiences are fundamentally constituted by our sensoromotor expectations.
Okay.
So our implicit understanding of how the world will change as we move and interact with it.
Okay.
The dispositional approach, which is advocated by philosophers like Evans and Brewer and Briscoe,
Right.
it suggests that the spatial content of our perceptual experiences is actually made possible by our dispositions to act in the world.
Okay, so it's not just passively receiving sensory information, but actively engaging with the world and understanding it in terms of our potential for action?
Exactly. However, a significant challenge for these sensoromotor views comes from cases where perception and action seem to be dissociated.
Okay.
For example, you have patients with numb sense. They might be able to point accurately to where they were touched, but they don't have any conscious feeling of being touched.
Okay.
Similarly, in the rubber hand illusion, individuals can often grasp their actual hand accurately,
Right.
even while feeling the touch on the rubber hand.
Okay.
So these dissociations suggest that sensoromotor knowledge might not always be necessary or sufficient
Right.
for bodily experiences.
Okay.
And the dispositional view arguably handles some of these dissociations more effectively than the inactive approach.
Okay, and what about the reverse? Does action require bodily awareness?
That's a great question. And philosophers like O'Shaughnessy and Wong have really explored this.
Yeah.
While it's clear that our actions, they rely on this detailed information about our body's effectors.
Right.
This information, it doesn't always seem to need to reach conscious awareness.
Okay.
So, for instance, deferented subjects who lack most proprioceptive feedback, they can still control their movements using visual feedback.
Okay.
So while Descartes was right that we're not just pilots in a ship because we have this internal experience of our bodies.
Yeah.
The precise nature of the connection between our ability to act and our conscious bodily awareness is still a subject of ongoing investigation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we also need to consider the role of effectively charged bodily experiences.
Okay.
Like pain, in motivating protective actions, which further distinguishes our relationship to our bodies from that of a pilot to a ship.
Okay. So this naturally leads us to the idea of mental representations and the body, particularly the concept of the body schema.
Right.
And this term seems to appear, frequently in discussions of bodily awareness.
It really does, and it's used in a variety of ways, leading to significant debate. One of the central issues is whether the body schema should be understood as a specific type of mental representation of the body, or as a more functional sort of sensoromotor capacity,
right,
that operates without explicit representational content.
Right.
And this is something that Merleau-Ponty argued for, and more recently Gallagher.
Right.
So this representationalist versus non-representationalist debate, it's really a key area of discussion in contemporary philosophy of mind and cognitive science.
So what motivates the argument for body representations? What explanatory power do they offer in terms of understanding bodily awareness?
Well, the representationalist approach, which has roots in the work of Bonnier and later Head and Holmes, it argues that we need to posit mental representations to adequately explain various aspects of our bodily awareness.
Okay.
A primary motivation, which is often highlighted by patient studies, is to account for disturbances in this awareness. So for example, the phenomenon of phantom limbs, that can be understood as the persistence of a representation of the missing limb.
Right.
While conditions like xenomelia, which is the desire to amputate a healthy limb,
wow,
that might arise from a disconnect
yeah.
between that limb and the individual's body representation.
Okay. So that makes sense. It provides a framework for understanding how our felt experience can actually diverge from the physical reality of our bodies.
Yeah.
What other arguments support the existence of body representation?
Well, another crucial argument relates to the spatial organization of our bodily awareness.
Okay.
Over time, our diverse bodily experiences, they share this common spatial framework that reflects the structure of our body.
Okay.
O'Shaughnessy, he proposed this concept of a long-term body image to explain this structural role.
Okay.
Some researchers even propose, hierarchical models, drawing an analogy to Marr's theory of vision, suggesting that increasingly complex and spatially detailed representations of the body are built up from basic sensory inputs, such as the homunculus in the primary somatosensory cortex.
Okay.
And this higher level body model, it's thought to operate somewhat independently of immediate sensory input,
Right.
and to be essential for organizing information from our various body senses.
And what form might these body representations take? I mean, are we talking about something like a mental map?
Well, there are various proposals.
Yeah.
Peacock suggests they might be akin to scenarios.
Yeah.
So non-conceptual analog spatial representations that correspond to different body parts.
Okay.
Others, like Brewer and Bermudez, they propose that these representations are more action oriented.
Now, is it a single unified body representation?
Yeah, good question.
Or do we have multiple, perhaps more localized models for different parts of the body?
That's another key area of inquiry.
Yeah.
Philosophers like L. Smith, they've argued for the possibility of a collection of local models for individual body parts.
Okay.
Consider tasks that require the coordinated movement of different limbs.
Right.
Is a global unified representation necessary to orchestrate these local representations?
Yeah.
Or can we function effectively with just the local ones?
Right. And the idea that there might be different types of body representation seems important here as well, especially given, the variety of disorders that affect bodily awareness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, Head and Holmes, they offered an early classification distinguishing between a conscious body image and two types of unconscious body schemata.
Okay.
Now, while the terminology has, it's been used somewhat interchangeably over time,
Yeah.
there's been a renewed effort to really differentiate between various types of body representation based on factors such as their accessibility to consciousness,
Okay.
their temporal dynamics, so short term versus long term, their functional role, so action guidance versus perceptual experience, their representational format,
Right.
the sensory modalities that they draw upon,
Yeah.
the specific bodily information that they encode. Hosts.